The rain was hammering against her kitchen window when Sarah heard the knock. Not the polite tap of a delivery person or the rhythmic pattern of someone expected, but desperate, urgent knocking that made her heart skip. She wasn't expecting anyone at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, especially not in the middle of a thunderstorm that had knocked out half the power lines in downtown Seattle. When she opened the door, her neighbor Marcus stood there soaking wet, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wild with something between panic and determination. Before she could ask what was wrong, he grabbed her shoulders gently but firmly, looked straight into her eyes, and said the words that would change everything between them. "Do you think I'm crazy?" And before she could answer, before she could even process what was happening, his lips were on hers with a passion that felt like it had been building for months, maybe years, and suddenly the storm outside seemed like nothing compared to what was happening right there in her doorway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who planned everything. At 28, she was a senior graphic designer at a boutique marketing firm, lived in a converted warehouse apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill district, and had her life mapped out in neat, color-coded calendars that hung on her refrigerator like badges of control. She'd moved to Seattle 3 years ago, after a messy breakup in Phoenix left her questioning everything she thought she knew about love and trust. The city's gray skies and constant drizzle matched her mood perfectly back then, and she'd chosen her apartment specifically because it was quiet, isolated, and came with neighbors who minded their own business. Her building was one of those industrial conversions that attracted young professionals who valued exposed brick and high ceilings over human connection. Most residents nodded politely in the hallway and kept walking, which suited Sarah just fine. She'd had enough drama to last a lifetime. Her ex-fiancé David had been the charming, unpredictable type who made grand gestures and broke promises with equal enthusiasm. When she caught him with her best friend at what was supposed to be their engagement party planning session, she decided that spontaneity and passion were overrated. What she wanted now was stability, predictability, and peace. The only neighbor who'd ever attempted real conversation was Marcus Chen, who lived in the unit directly across from hers. He was probably in his early 30s, worked from home doing something with computer programming or web development, and had the kind of quiet intensity that made Sarah both curious and cautious. He was tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and expressive dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. When they passed in the hallway, he always smiled and asked genuine questions about her day, not just the perfunctory, "How's it going?" that most people offered. There was something different about him, something that made her conversations with him linger in her mind longer than they should have. Marcus had moved in about 6 months after Sarah, and she'd noticed him immediately. Not because he was conventionally handsome, though he was attractive in an understated way, but because he seemed to exist in a state of barely contained energy. He was always carrying sketchbooks or notebooks, always seemed to be working on some project that had him up until odd hours. She could hear him moving around his apartment late at night, not loudly or disruptively, but with the restless energy of someone whose mind never quite settled. Sometimes she'd see lights spilling from under his door at 2 or 3 in the morning and wonder what kept him awake. Their first real conversation happened on a Saturday morning in the building's shared laundry room. Sarah was folding towels and listening to a podcast about design trends when Marcus appeared with a basket of clothes and an apologetic expression. He'd clearly been putting off laundry for too long, and the machines were both occupied. They ended up talking for nearly an hour while waiting for cycles to finish, and Sarah found herself genuinely laughing for the first time in months. Marcus had a dry sense of humor and an unexpected knowledge of random topics that made conversation flow naturally. He told her about growing up in Portland with parents who were both professors, about studying computer science but wanting to write novels, about moving to Seattle because it felt like a city where someone could disappear and reinvent themselves. What struck Sarah most about that conversation was how present Marcus seemed. He didn't check his phone once, didn't seem distracted or eager to leave. When she mentioned her work in graphic design, he asked thoughtful questions about her creative process and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. It had been so long since someone had paid attention to what she was actually saying rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. When their laundry was done and they were heading back to their respective apartments, Marcus paused at his door and said, "I know everyone in this building keeps to themselves, but if you ever want company for coffee or just need someone to talk to, I'm usually around." The offer was casual, friendly, with no undertones of pressure or expectation, and Sarah found herself more tempted than she wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, they developed an easy rhythm of brief encounters that gradually grew longer and more personal. Marcus would often be getting his mail when Sarah returned from work, and their hallway conversations began stretching from a few minutes to nearly half an hour. He had an unusual way of asking questions that made Sarah want to give real answers instead of polite deflections. When he asked about her weekend plans, she found herself admitting that she usually spent Saturdays reorganizing her apartment and Sundays meal prepping for the entire week. Instead of judging her routine-focused lifestyle, Marcus seemed genuinely curious about how she'd developed such detailed systems for managing her time and space. Marcus, she learned, was the opposite of organized. His apartment, from what she could glimpse when his door was open, looked like a hurricane had blown through a library and an art supply store. Books were stacked in precarious towers, notebooks and loose papers covered every surface, and there always seemed to be multiple projects in various stages of completion scattered around his living space. But despite the chaos of his environment, he had an almost zen-like calm about him that Sarah found both mysterious and appealing. He never seemed stressed about deadlines or worried about the future in the way that consumed most people their age. The shift in their relationship began on a particularly gray Thursday evening in November. Sarah had been working late on a challenging rebranding project and came home exhausted and frustrated. She was struggling with her keys, juggling her laptop bag and a container of leftover Thai food, when Marcus's door opened. Instead of the usual cheerful greeting, he took one look at her face and simply said, "Rough day?" Something in his tone, gentle and understanding without being patronizing, made Sarah's carefully constructed composure crack slightly. She found herself nodding and admitting that work had been overwhelming lately, that she felt like she was constantly fighting to prove herself in a field that often dismissed women's ideas as too soft or not strategic enough. Marcus listened without offering solutions or trying to minimize her frustration. When she finished venting, he said, "I was just about to make some tea and work on a completely pointless art project. Want to join me?" Sometimes the best cure for a terrible day is doing something that serves no practical purpose whatsoever. The invitation was so different from anything David would have offered. Her ex would have launched into advice about networking or suggested she find a new job if she was unhappy. Marcus was simply offering presence and distraction without trying to fix anything. Sarah surprised herself by accepting. Marcus's apartment was exactly as chaotic as she'd imagined, but there was something warm and lived in about the mess that felt more welcoming than her own precisely organized space. Books were everywhere, but they were clearly loved and frequently referenced rather than just decorative. Sketches and half-finished paintings covered the walls, and there were plants in various stages of health scattered throughout the room. Marcus made tea in mismatched mugs and cleared space at a table covered with what appeared to be architectural drawings for an imaginary city. They spent the next 3 hours working on a collaborative map of a fictional neighborhood, complete with coffee shops that only served dessert, bookstores organized by the emotional impact of their contents, and a park where it was always the perfect temperature for napping. Working on something creative and completely pointless with Marcus felt like coming up for air after being underwater for months. Sarah realized she hadn't done anything purely for fun since moving to Seattle. Everything in her life served a purpose, moved her towards some goal, or improved her situation in measurable ways. Drawing ridiculous buildings and inventing backstories for imaginary residents felt rebellious and necessary in a way she hadn't expected. Marcus worked with focused intensity but also playfulness, adding details that made Sarah laugh and building on her ideas in ways that made them better and stranger. When she finally looked at the clock, it was nearly midnight, and she felt more relaxed than she had in months. As she gathered her things to leave, Marcus walked her to the door and said, "Thank you for letting me kidnap your evening. I know you probably had more important things to do." Sarah realized that for the first time in years she'd spent hours without checking her phone, without reviewing her to-do list, without thinking about tomorrow's obligations. "Actually," she said, "this was exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know I needed it." Marcus smiled, and there was something in his expression that made Sarah's pulse quicken slightly. "Well," he said, "my door's always open if you want to escape reality again sometime." The evening marked the beginning of a friendship that felt both natural and slightly dangerous. Sarah found herself looking forward to running into Marcus in the hallway, and their conversations began extending beyond casual pleasantries into territory that felt more intimate and honest than anything she'd shared with most people she'd known for years. Marcus had a way of asking follow-up questions that showed he'd been thinking about things she'd mentioned days or weeks earlier. He remembered that she'd been nervous about a presentation and asked how it went. He noticed when she seemed tired or stressed, and offered small gestures of support, like leaving coffee and a funny note by her door on particularly difficult mornings. What made their developing friendship feel different from anything Sarah had experienced was how effortless it seemed. With David, there had always been an undercurrent of performance, a sense that she needed to be a certain version of herself to maintain his interest. With Marcus, she found herself sharing thoughts and opinions she usually kept private, admitting to fears and dreams that felt too vulnerable to voice with most people. Marcus listened without judgment and shared his own uncertainties with equal openness. He told her about feeling stuck between his practical programming work and his desire to write, about worrying that he was wasting his potential by not committing fully to either path. Their friendship deepened through small, consistent interactions rather than dramatic moments. Marcus would text her articles he thought she'd find interesting, usually related to design or psychology or some random topic they'd discussed. Sarah began stopping by his apartment when she needed a break from her own orderly space, and they developed a routine of working on creative projects together while discussing everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about success and happiness. Marcus's approach to life was so different from Sarah's that spending time with him felt like exploring a foreign country where the rules and priorities she'd always followed didn't necessarily apply. The first time Sarah realized her feelings for Marcus had shifted beyond friendship was during one of their evening creative sessions. They were working on a collaborative story about time travelers who could only visit mundane moments in history, and Marcus was acting out a scene involving a time traveler trying to blend in at a 1950s grocery store. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His dramatic interpretation of someone pretending to understand the social dynamics of buying milk had Sarah laughing so hard she could barely breathe. In that moment, watching him be completely unselfconscious and silly, she felt a surge of affection that was definitely not platonic. The realization scared her more than it should have. Sarah had promised herself after David that she wouldn't get involved with anyone who represented uncertainty or emotional risk. Marcus was creative, spontaneous, and still figuring out major aspects of his life, all qualities that should have sent her running. But instead of feeling anxious about her growing feelings, she found herself drawn to the way Marcus approached uncertainty as an adventure rather than a problem to be solved. He talked about not knowing exactly where his career was heading with excitement rather than panic, as if the unknown possibilities were gifts waiting to be unwrapped rather than threats to be managed. Winter in Seattle arrived early that year, and with it came a shift in the dynamic between Sarah and Marcus. The shorter days and longer nights seemed to create more opportunities for the kind of deep conversations that revealed layers of personality and history they hadn't shared before. Sarah learned that Marcus had been engaged once to his college girlfriend, but had called it off 6 months before the wedding when he realized they'd been planning a life together without ever discussing what they actually wanted from marriage. He'd moved to Seattle partly to escape the aftermath of that decision and the disappointment of both families who'd been planning the wedding for over a year. Marcus's story resonated with Sarah in unexpected ways. Like her, he'd come to Seattle seeking distance from a relationship that had ended not in dramatic betrayal, but in the quieter tragedy of realizing they'd been trying to build something with the wrong person. Unlike Sarah, though, Marcus seemed to have processed his experience as evidence that following his instincts was more important than meeting external expectations, while Sarah had interpreted her breakup as proof that trusting her feelings led to poor decisions. Their different responses to similar experiences became a recurring theme in their conversations, with Marcus gently challenging Sarah's conviction that emotional detachment was safer than vulnerability. As winter deepened, Sarah began noticing small changes in Marcus's behavior that suggested his feelings for her might be evolving as well. He started finding more excuses to spend time together, suggesting they work on projects at coffee shops or inviting her to join him for walks around the neighborhood, even when the weather was less than ideal. His casual touches became more frequent and lingered longer, a hand on her shoulder when he was looking at something she was working on, brushing her fingers when he handed her tea, sitting close enough on his couch that she could feel the warmth from his body. The increased physical awareness between them created a tension that was both exciting and terrifying for Sarah. The evening that changed everything began like dozens of others they'd shared. Sarah had been working on a particularly frustrating logo design that seemed to resist every approach she tried, and Marcus had suggested she bring her laptop over to work in his space while he tackled some coding problems. They'd developed a comfortable routine of working in parallel, occasionally bouncing ideas off each other or taking breaks to discuss whatever random topic occurred to one of them. That night, though, Marcus seemed restless in a way that was unusual for him. He kept getting up to pace around the apartment, starting sentences and not finishing them, and checking his phone more frequently than normal. After watching him circle the living room for the third time in an hour, Sarah finally asked if something was bothering him. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something between determination and panic. "Actually," he said, "there is something I need to talk to you about, but I'm not sure how to bring it up without potentially ruining everything we have." The seriousness in his tone made Sarah close her laptop and give him her full attention. She'd seen Marcus uncertain about career decisions or creative projects, but never about interpersonal situations. He was usually the one who made social interactions feel easy and natural. Marcus sat down across from her but didn't make eye contact immediately. "I know we've never talked about this directly," he began, "but I think we both know that what we have isn't exactly a normal friendship anymore." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I've been trying to convince myself that I'm imagining the connection between us, that it's better to preserve what we have than risk changing it. But I can't keep pretending I don't have feelings for you that go beyond friendship." He finally looked at her directly, and Sarah could see vulnerability in his expression that made her chest tight. "The thing is, I know you've been hurt before, and I know you value stability and predictability. I'm not sure I can offer you those things, at least not in the traditional sense." The honesty in Marcus's confession made Sarah realize how much she'd been avoiding examining her own feelings. She'd allowed herself to enjoy their friendship and appreciate the way he made her feel, but she'd been deliberately avoiding the question of what she wanted their relationship to become. Hearing him voice his uncertainty about whether he could provide what she needed forced her to consider whether what she needed had changed since meeting him. "What do you think I need?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perception of her priorities. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you need someone who won't disappear when things get complicated. Someone who pays attention to who you actually are rather than who they want you to be. And someone who makes you feel safe enough to be yourself completely." He paused, then added, "I can't promise you a 5-year plan or guarantee that I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise you those things. The question is whether that's enough, or whether you need more certainty than I'm capable of providing right now." Sarah realized that Marcus's understanding of her needs was more accurate than her own had been. She'd been so focused on avoiding the chaos and unpredictability that had characterized her relationship with David that she'd overlooked the difference between destructive instability and healthy growth. Marcus's uncertainty about his career path wasn't the same as David's pattern of making promises he couldn't keep. Marcus's creative chaos wasn't the same as David's emotional unavailability disguised as spontaneity. For the first time since her breakup, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that safety might come from being with someone who valued honesty and consistency, rather than someone who offered conventional markers of stability. The conversation continued past midnight, with both of them exploring questions they'd been avoiding for months. Sarah admitted that she'd been developing feelings for Marcus, but had been frightened by how different he was from the kind of person she'd thought she should be with. Marcus acknowledged that his attraction to Sarah went beyond physical or romantic interest to include genuine admiration for her intelligence, creativity, and the way she approached challenges with both analytical thinking and intuitive problem-solving. They talked about their fears, their past relationships, and what they hoped for in the future, but they didn't make any decisions about what would happen between them. When Sarah finally returned to her own apartment that night, she felt both exhilarated and exhausted. The conversation with Marcus had been more honest and revealing than most of the discussions she'd had with David during their entire 2-year relationship. She lay awake thinking about the difference between the anxiety she'd felt with David, which had been based on constantly wondering where she stood with him, and the nervousness she felt about Marcus, which was based on wondering whether she was brave enough to take a risk on something that felt potentially wonderful but uncertain. The next few days passed in a strange state of heightened awareness between Sarah and Marcus. They continued their usual pattern of friendly interactions, but there was an undercurrent of unresolved tension that made every conversation feel loaded with additional meaning. Sarah found herself analyzing Marcus's words and gestures for signs of what he was thinking and feeling, while simultaneously trying to figure out what she wanted to happen next. The liminal space between friendship and something more felt both exciting and unsustainable. The shift that pushed them beyond the realm of possibility into reality happened during one of Seattle's infamous winter storms. Sarah had been working late at her office downtown when the rain began in earnest, quickly escalating into the kind of downpour that made driving dangerous and walking impossible. By the time she made it home, she was soaked through her supposedly waterproof jacket and shivering from a combination of cold and adrenaline. The building's heating system had been struggling all week, and her apartment felt barely warmer than the hallway. Sarah was in the process of changing into dry clothes when the power went out completely. The building's backup generator kicked in briefly, providing emergency lighting in the hallways, but individual units were left in darkness. She was searching for candles and flashlights when she heard Marcus knocking on her door. When she opened it, he was holding a battery-powered lantern and wearing an expression of concern that made her realize how much she'd come to depend on his presence in her daily life. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping into her apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I heard you come in and then everything went dark. I wanted to make sure you weren't stuck without light or heat." The thoughtfulness of his gesture, showing up to check on her within minutes of the power outage, highlighted the way Marcus had become attuned to her needs and routines in a way that felt both natural and profound. He'd noticed her arrival home and thought about whether she might need help, then acted on that concern immediately. They decided to wait out the storm together in Marcus's apartment, which retained heat better due to its corner location and heavy curtains. Marcus had gathered battery-powered lights, blankets, and supplies for making hot drinks on his camping stove, transforming the power outage from an inconvenience into an adventure. The combination of candlelight, the sound of rain against the windows, and the cozy isolation created an atmosphere that felt both intimate and magical. They spent the evening talking in lower voices than usual, sharing stories they'd never told each other, and discussing dreams and fears that felt too personal for normal conversation. As the night progressed, Sarah became increasingly aware of the physical space between them on Marcus's couch. They were sitting closer than usual, ostensibly to share warmth and the limited light, but the proximity made every small movement and gesture feel significant. When Marcus reached across her to adjust a blanket, when their hands brushed while reaching for the same mug, when he turned to look at her while making a point and their faces ended up inches apart, Sarah felt a building tension that was both wonderful and almost unbearable. The moment that shifted everything happened near midnight, when the storm reached its peak intensity. Thunder was rolling through the building in waves that made the windows vibrate, and Sarah mentioned that storms had always made her feel simultaneously excited and anxious. Marcus asked her to explain the contradiction, and she found herself describing the way severe weather made her feel both more aware of her vulnerability and more connected to something powerful and larger than herself. As she was talking, a particularly loud clap of thunder made her jump and move instinctively closer to Marcus. Instead of the casual comfort she'd expected, the contact created a moment of electric awareness that made both of them freeze. Sarah realized she was close enough to see the flecks of gold in Marcus's dark eyes, close enough to feel his breath on her face, close enough that moving just slightly forward would bring their lips together. The awareness hung between them for several heartbeats, charged with months of building connection and unspoken attraction. Sarah saw Marcus's expression shift from surprise to something more intense, and she knew that whatever happened next would change their relationship permanently. The kiss, when it finally happened, was nothing like the careful, tentative exploration Sarah had expected. Instead, it felt like the culmination of months of emotional intimacy finally finding physical expression. Marcus's hand came up to cup her face, and Sarah felt herself responding with a passion that surprised her. The kiss deepened naturally, and Sarah realized that all her careful analysis and worry about timing and appropriateness were completely irrelevant in the face of how right this felt. Everything about being close to Marcus felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure simultaneously. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss alone could account for, Marcus rested his forehead against Sarah's and said softly, "I've been wanting to do that since about our third conversation in the laundry room." Sarah laughed, a sound that felt lighter and more genuine than anything that had come out of her mouth in months. "Why didn't you?" she asked. Marcus's answer was serious despite his smile. Because I wanted to be sure it was something you wanted too, not just something that happened because we were spending so much time together. The consideration Marcus had shown, waiting until he was confident that Sarah's feelings matched his own rather than making assumptions or putting pressure on her, felt like the most romantic gesture anyone had ever made toward her. David had been impulsive in ways that often felt selfish, making grand gestures that were more about his own need for drama than her actual desires. Marcus's restraint and attention to her comfort made Sarah feel valued and respected in a way that was entirely new to her experience of romantic relationships. They spent the rest of the night talking about what the kiss meant and what they wanted to happen next. Marcus was characteristically direct about his feelings and intentions, telling Sarah that he'd been falling for her gradually over months, and that kissing her felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sarah admitted that she'd been fighting her attraction to him because it scared her how much she cared about his opinion and how disappointed she would be if things didn't work out between them. They agreed to move forward slowly, acknowledging both the strength of their connection and the importance of building something sustainable rather than getting swept away by the intensity of finally expressing their feelings. The morning after the storm brought bright sunshine and a sense of new beginning that felt almost too symbolic to be real. Sarah woke up on Marcus's couch, covered with a blanket he must have placed over her after she fell asleep during their conversation. The smell of coffee and something that might have been pancakes was coming from the kitchen, and she could hear Marcus moving around quietly, trying not to wake her. The domesticity of the scene felt both surreal and perfectly natural, as if this was how her mornings were always supposed to begin. When Marcus noticed she was awake, he brought her coffee in one of his mismatched mugs and sat down beside her with his own cup. "Good morning," he said, and Sarah could hear a question in his tone, as if he was checking to make sure she didn't regret anything that had happened the night before. "Good morning," she replied, leaning over to kiss him briefly, a gesture that felt both bold and completely right. The smile that spread across Marcus's face made Sarah's chest warm in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. They spent that morning creating new routines and inside jokes, Marcus making breakfast while Sarah organized his chaotic spice cabinet, both of them marveling at how easy it felt to share space and small tasks. The physical affection that had been building between them for months now had permission to exist openly, and they found themselves reaching for each other constantly, small touches and brief kisses that felt like punctuation marks in their conversations. Sarah realized that she'd never experienced this kind of casual intimacy with anyone, the sense that physical affection could be both meaningful and effortless. The integration of their romantic relationship into their daily lives happened more smoothly than Sarah had dared to hope. Instead of the dramatic restructuring she'd expected, being with Marcus romantically felt like the logical extension of the friendship and connection they'd already built. They continued working on creative projects together, but now Sarah felt free to curl up against Marcus while they brainstormed, or to kiss him when he said something particularly clever or funny. The physical dimension of their relationship enhanced rather than complicated their intellectual and emotional connection. Sarah's anxiety about whether she was making another impulsive mistake gradually gave way to recognition that her relationship with Marcus was fundamentally different from anything she'd experienced before. With David, she'd often felt like she was trying to solve a puzzle, interpreting his moods and reactions to figure out how to maintain his interest and approval. With Marcus, communication was straightforward and honest. Conflicts were addressed directly rather than avoided or dramatized, and Sarah felt confident that he valued her opinions and feelings even when they disagreed about something. The first real test of their relationship came about a month later, when Marcus received an offer for a short-term contract job that would require him to spend 6 weeks working remotely from Portland. The opportunity was professionally exciting and financially beneficial, but it would also mean temporary separation just as their romantic relationship was beginning to solidify. Sarah's immediate reaction was panic, flashbacks to David's pattern of making unilateral decisions that affected both of them without consulting her first. But Marcus's approach to the situation was completely different. Instead of presenting the job offer as a decision he'd already made, Marcus asked Sarah to help him think through the pros and cons. He was genuinely conflicted about leaving Seattle just as their relationship was deepening, but he was also excited about the project and concerned about turning down opportunities that could advance his career. They spent several evenings discussing the practical and emotional implications of a temporary separation, with Marcus consistently prioritizing Sarah's feelings and concerns alongside his professional considerations. His willingness to make the decision collaboratively rather than independently made Sarah realize how much she trusted his judgment and commitment to their relationship. Ultimately, they decided that Marcus should take the job, with plans for Sarah to visit Portland twice during his stay and for them to maintain regular communication through video calls and messaging. The decision-making process itself strengthened Sarah's confidence in their relationship, demonstrating that they could navigate challenging situations as a team rather than as individuals whose interests might conflict. Marcus's consideration for her feelings and their relationship gave Sarah the security she needed to encourage him to pursue an opportunity that would benefit his career, even though it meant temporary sacrifice for both of them. The 6 weeks of separation were difficult but also revelatory. Sarah discovered that missing Marcus felt completely different from the anxiety she'd experienced during David's frequent business trips. With David, his absences had always felt like threats to their relationship, opportunities for him to realize he preferred freedom to commitment, or to meet someone more interesting than Sarah. Missing Marcus felt sad but secure, an unfortunate consequence of circumstances rather than a sign that their relationship was fragile or uncertain. Their daily video calls became highlights of Sarah's routine, and she found herself looking forward to sharing details of her day and hearing about Marcus's project with an enthusiasm that surprised her. The physical distance made their emotional connection feel even more valuable, and Sarah realized that the foundation of their relationship was strong enough to withstand temporary challenges. Marcus's consistent communication and obvious excitement about returning to Seattle eliminated any doubts Sarah might have had about his commitment to their future together. When Marcus returned from Portland, their reunion felt like a celebration of everything they'd built together and confirmation that they'd successfully navigated their first significant test as a couple. The time apart had given both of them perspective on how much they valued their relationship and confidence that they could handle future challenges with the same collaborative approach they'd used to manage the separation. Sarah felt more secure in her feelings for Marcus and more optimistic about their long-term potential than she'd ever felt about any romantic relationship. The months that followed established patterns and rhythms that made Sarah understand what people meant when they talked about relationships feeling like partnerships. She and Marcus developed systems for managing their individual careers and shared responsibilities, ways of supporting each other's goals while maintaining their own identities and interests. Sarah found herself becoming more spontaneous and creative under Marcus's influence, while Marcus began incorporating some of Sarah's organizational strategies into his work and personal life. They influenced each other in ways that felt mutually beneficial rather than restrictive. Sarah's family and friends, when they eventually met Marcus, were surprised by how relaxed and genuinely happy she seemed. Her sister commented that Sarah had always seemed slightly on edge in previous relationships, as if she was constantly monitoring her own performance and trying to anticipate problems. With Marcus, Sarah appeared completely comfortable being herself, confident that she was valued and accepted exactly as she was. The difference was apparent even in casual interactions, the way Sarah laughed more freely and expressed opinions without second-guessing herself. The evening that Marcus asked Sarah to move in with him began with what seemed like a routine dinner at their favorite neighborhood restaurant. They'd been officially together for almost 8 months, and talk of future plans had become a natural part of their conversations. Marcus had been hinting for weeks that he was thinking about their living situation, mentioning how much time Sarah spent at his apartment and joking about her clothes gradually taking over his closet space. Sarah had been thinking along similar lines but hadn't wanted to pressure Marcus or assume he was ready for that level of commitment. Over dessert, Marcus became uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and starting sentences without finishing them. Sarah was about to ask what was bothering him when he reached across the table to take her hand and said, "I have something I want to ask you, but I'm worried you'll think I'm moving too fast or being presumptuous." The seriousness in his tone made Sarah give him her full attention, though she was smiling at how endearing he looked when he was nervous. "I know we haven't been together very long in the grand scheme of things," Marcus began, "but I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I can't imagine wanting to share my daily life with anyone else." He paused, took a breath, then continued, "I was wondering if you'd want to move in together, not because it's the logical next step, or because it would be more convenient, but because I love the idea of building a home with you and waking up next to you every morning, and sharing all the small moments that make up a life." Sarah's immediate reaction was joy, followed quickly by a moment of panic as she realized how much she wanted to say yes and how different that was from her usual approach to major decisions. With David, she'd analyzed every relationship milestone extensively, weighing pros and cons and consulting friends and family before making commitments. With Marcus, her instinct was to trust the feeling of rightness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. The contrast made her realize how much she'd changed since meeting him, how much more willing she'd become to trust her emotions alongside her analytical mind. "Yes," she said, before her cautious side could interfere with her honest response. "I want that too." Marcus's face lit up with relief and excitement, and Sarah felt a surge of certainty that this was exactly the right decision at exactly the right time. They spent the rest of dinner making plans and sharing their vision for the life they wanted to create together. From practical considerations like whose furniture to keep, to dreams about travel and future goals they wanted to pursue as a team, the process of combining their lives and belongings felt like a physical manifestation of the emotional integration that had been happening gradually over months. Sarah's organized systems and Marcus's creative chaos found a balance that worked for both of them, creating a shared space that reflected both their personalities without requiring either of them to sacrifice their individual preferences. They established routines that honored both Sarah's need for structure and Marcus's preference for spontaneity, finding ways to plan and organize that still left room for unexpected adventures and creative projects. Living together revealed new dimensions of compatibility that strengthened Sarah's confidence in their long-term potential. They navigated the typical challenges of cohabitation, learning each other's habits and preferences around everything from morning routines to household chores. But the process felt collaborative rather than conflicted. Marcus's willingness to compromise and adapt balanced Sarah's tendency toward control, while Sarah's organizational skills complemented Marcus's creative energy in ways that benefited both of them. 6 months after moving in together, Sarah realized that her relationship with Marcus had become the foundation from which she approached everything else in her life. His support and encouragement had given her the confidence to take on more challenging projects at work, to reconnect with creative interests she'd abandoned after her breakup with David, and to maintain friendships and family relationships with less anxiety and more authenticity. Marcus's consistent presence and unconditional acceptance had created a sense of security that allowed Sarah to take risks and pursue growth in other areas of her life. The evening that crystallized Sarah's understanding of what she and Marcus had built together began with Marcus returning from a particularly stressful day of debugging problematic code for a difficult client. He was frustrated and exhausted in a way that was unusual for him, and Sarah could see that the day had been genuinely challenging rather than just annoying. Instead of trying to fix the problem or offer solutions, Sarah simply listened while Marcus vented about the technical issues and personality conflicts that had made his day so difficult. After Marcus finished explaining the situation, Sarah asked if he wanted advice or just wanted her to listen. The question itself demonstrated how well they'd learned to communicate with each other, recognizing that sometimes support meant problem-solving, and sometimes it meant simply providing a safe space for frustration. Marcus said he just needed to decompress, so they spent the evening cooking together and working on a puzzle, letting the familiar rhythm of shared activity restore his equilibrium. Later, as they prepared for bed, Marcus thanked Sarah for knowing exactly what he needed without him having to ask for it. That moment of quiet understanding felt like the truest expression of love either of them had ever experienced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.